Hi, hello everybody. I'm Mike Franch. I'm a board member and past president of the Baltimore City Historical Society. Welcome to the Baltimore City Historical Society's first Baltimore History Evening that isn't on a Thursday. Since 2009, we've offered 6 Baltimore History Evenings from January through June at the Village Learning Place in Charles Village. Even when the pandemic ended in-person presentations in March, thanks to Zoom, we were able to finish our 2020 Thursday evening series. This Zoom technology lets us continue to offer this series in cyberspace, but it does something more. It's always been a problem when something new came up, such as a new book on Baltimore history or a historian visiting Baltimore, and we've had to say, sorry, our schedule for this year is filled, or sorry, but we don't have a place for your talk. Now we've been freed from the constraints of time and space. Tonight's talk is the first of a series of talks that will occur as opportunity presents. We'll still be doing our traditional 6 evenings on the third Thursday, January through June, but now expect more opportunities to enjoy Baltimore history. Watch our webpage or join our Baltimore History Facebook page to find out when things are coming up. And thanks to technology, all these talks are recorded and will be available on our Baltimore City Historical Society YouTube channel. Just look us up, go to YouTube and then Baltimore City Historical Society. Well, enough for previews of coming attractions. Allison Seiler, one of our board members, will tell you how we're going to do things tonight and introduce our speaker. Allison, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Allison Seiler, and I'm a board member on BCHS. I've had the pleasure of serving on the board since 2018. In my day job, I'm an archivist at Hopkins University, but tonight I will be your Zoom host. I will be paying attention to the chat. I'll be muting people. As you might have noticed, when you entered, you were muted. We ask that you remain on mute throughout the program, and that's just in order for the program to, the presentation to flow without interruption. And I'll be keeping an eye out. If you need anything through Zoom, please just send me a chat or grab my attention that way. In terms of the presentation, we'll be listening to our speaker for about a half hour, and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So I'd ask that you put any questions you might have in our chat directly into the chat. I'll go through and I will pull those out and keep track of those for Mary once we get to the question and answer session. So it's possible we won't get to them all, but I'll do my best to try to round them up for her. I'll also be sharing a few links in the chat, so just pay attention to that if you would. Maybe some links to a book we'll be talking about, maybe some links to contact Mary through Twitter if that's your jam. And lastly, like I said, if you need anything throughout the evening, please feel free to send me a message and I'll try to help and be your tech guru. Now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce a public history mentor of mine, Mary Rizzo. Mary is a writer and educator who specializes in modern U.S. cultural history, urban studies, the public humanities, and the digital humanities. Her newest book, Come and Be Shocked, Baltimore Beyond John Waters and the Wire, which I have my copy right here. It's a beautiful cover. We're going to be talking about tonight, examines battles over the image of Baltimore by famous and infamous artists and city agencies trying to woo tourists and residents, but also showing how culture shapes cities and vice versa. As a public historian, Mary has done everything from lead tours of an 18th century house museum to strategic planning for the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. She brings her passion for inclusive history, public history, to her work at Rutgers University, Newark, where she created the Public Humanities MA track in the graduate program in American Studies, which helps prepare students to be leaders in public history and humanities organizations. In 2014, while researching Come and Be Shocked, I think a lot of the Baltimore folks will find this really interesting, Mary rediscovered a poetry magazine called Chicory, which was published by the Enoch Pratt Free Library from 1966 to 1983. And she partnered with the Pratt to make the archives of the magazine available online. And she helped found the Chicory Revitalization Project. Mary's also the author of another book called Class Acts, Young Men and the Rise of Lifestyle. Tonight, Mary will talk about, quote, Mermaids and Promenades, as she delves into William Donald Schaefer and the cultural redevelopment of Baltimore. So with that, Mary, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Allison, and I am so delighted to be here. I almost wish that we could just like sort of sit around and talk, because I am a big fan of a lot of people in this room and know your work, and I know that that you all have a lot of really amazing Baltimore history to share as well. But I guess you're all here to hear me talk, so I will do that. But first, I really want to thank Allison for inviting me to this event tonight. I've known Allison for actually kind of a really long time. I co-taught a class at UMBC a million years ago that she was in, and it's been really delightful to see her public history career take off and to follow that from afar. So it's a real honor for me to be here, and thank you, Allison, for inviting me. So let me share my screen so I can show you the PowerPoint presentation that I have as well. In 2014, Mike Rowe, the host of the TV shows Dirty Jobs and Somebody's Gotta Do It, which profiled people doing difficult or dangerous jobs, got into a very public fight with writer and journalist David Simon, who's best known as the creator of two TV shows, Homicide, about homicide cops in the city, and The Wire, a gritty drama about cops and drug dealers in Baltimore. Spread over dueling blog posts and newspaper articles, the essential conflict between the two men was over whether an artist has a responsibility to portray a city in a positive light, or if they should reveal negative issues through their work. Rowe, who's born in Baltimore, argued that Simon's shows had damaged not only Baltimore's reputation, but its chance for economic growth. As he wrote, Homicide in The Wire, quote, convinced millions of Americans that Baltimore is a fantastic place to buy drugs, find a whore, or get murdered. Better yet, all three at once. For Rowe, the role of the artist was to help raise attention of the positive things happening in a place. He wanted to see shows that highlighted regular people helping each other out, as well as the effort of Baltimore City administrations to sell Baltimore as a, quote, destination city. Now, he wasn't suggesting that Baltimore doesn't have any problems, right? But he was really seeing the role of the media as prioritizing positive stories rather than negative ones. So it'll surprise no one that David Simon took a very different approach and saw the situation quite differently. Simon argued that his work, which chronicles those Baltimore residents whose lives and neighborhoods have been devastated by political policies, had both an artistic and a civic purpose, different than Rowe's vision. Simon thought that his representations of Baltimore could, quote, help lead to redress and reconsideration of certain policies and priorities. For him, storytelling shouldn't simply, quote, affirm what those in power wish to have said about just how swell they've administered things. Artists, he thought, must counter the official mouthpieces of politicians and promotional campaigns. They must supply, he argued, quote, some measure of dissent. But what both men agreed on was that the representation of a city and culture was important, that it could shape people's ideas about a place, encourage them to visit it or avoid it, or expose the wrongdoing of elites and have a political purpose. So in my book, Come and Be Shocked, Baltimore Beyond John Waters and The Wire, I begin from this exact premise, right? The representation of a place that we see and consume in popular culture matters. Those representations shape how we know a place. And I'm willing to bet, if like we unmuted, that each of us has in our mind right now an image of a place that we've never been to before, but that we have some idea about in our head, right? We could probably just like rattle off a few obvious ones. So Paris is a romantic city. Tokyo is an orderly city. And when we say that out loud, they kind of seem like banal connections, right? Like what meaning does that actually have? But I would argue that those associations have real material consequences. Now, what drew me to write this book was realizing that for a medium-sized city like Baltimore, it's been the subject of and setting for a number of cultural representations since the 1950s, and some that are very impactful and consequential. So in the book, I look at a wide range of these cultural figures and representations. I look at novelists like William Manchester, novelists / journalists like William Manchester and David Simon, filmmakers like John Waters and Barry Levinson, and novelists Ann Tyler and Laura Lippman, among many others. And through these artists, I argue that Baltimore has actually assumed a cultural importance far beyond its actual size. Now, lest you think that all the artists that I look at are white, I do want to underline that in the book I talk about African-American artists and cultural representations as well. And I did want to point out too that especially in the very recent past, in the last few years, we've seen really important representations of Baltimore coming out of the African-American community, particularly through the memoirs of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Dee Watkins. But there are others as well. And I'd be happy to talk about those afterwards in the Q&A if anyone is interested. Right? But overall, these representations together really shape how people think about Baltimore, right? So much so that when former Baltimore mayor and Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley ran in the Democratic primary during the 2016 election, he was repeatedly asked about The Wire, as if that TV show was like a documentary about Baltimore rather than a fictional show that's based in truth, right, in reality, but is still fictional. So it got so pervasive. He was asked about the Wire so often that Saturday Night Live actually parodied it on one episode of the show where they had the actors doing a skit around 2016 Democratic primary debate, right? So what we see here is this fictionalized depiction of Baltimore actually affected a political campaign, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that O'Malley would have been the Democratic nominee in 2016 if The Wire didn't exist. But what I am suggesting is the existence of The Wire fundamentally changed how that campaign worked and his political career in the negative for him, I think. So I argue in the book that Baltimore became a powerful setting for these cultural representations because it is a microcosm. And it includes within it issues and tensions that affect cities everywhere. So Baltimore is a very unique place, of course, but the tensions and history that it has actually is representative of issues that are happening to cities around the nation. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it works so well as a setting for these cultural representations, right? So, of course, Baltimore exists geographically on the border between the North and the South. And in that regard, it actually really does encompass a number of the issues and characteristics of both the North and the South in one small city. So as you know, right, for a lot of its history, Baltimore was an industrial economy. It was shaped primarily around manufacturing and industry. But of course, starting in the mid-20th century, that changes and the city goes through a period of deindustrialization into what is now really a service economy. And that shift, of course, is something that has happened to Rust Belt cities throughout the nation. So that Baltimore can represent that shift very well. One of the other, I think, key things about Baltimore that makes it a microcosm is its demography as well. So Baltimore has very large European immigrant populations that have settled in the city. And in that way, it makes it reflective of cities in the North and the Midwest, for example. But it has also had, since before the Civil War, a large African-American community. And of course, has been a majority African-American city for many decades now. So that Black population also adds a tension to the city between these two groups and has shaped the city, how the city has developed. And certainly we can talk about the issues around residential segregation, which I talk about in the book, as well in the Q&A. But overall, what I want to argue is that Baltimore has this representative quality because of all of these different characteristics coming together. But, and really this is the topic for my talk tonight, there's another reason that I chose Baltimore as my case study, besides the fact that it's like a cool city and it's was really wonderful to do a lot of research there. But more importantly is that Baltimore became a leader in the 1970s of cities that used art and culture to deal with economic change. So while artists have made culture set in Baltimore for decades, right, an important shift happened in the 1970s with the mayoral administration of William Donald Schaefer, someone who many of you might remember when he was mayor of the city. And I'm very excited to hear your thoughts about that. So when Schaefer became mayor in 1971, he was confronted with a city that was dealing with deindustrialization and population loss. And Schaefer really made a gamble at that point. And his gamble was whether arts and culture could be central to Baltimore's revitalization. Now, doing so, making arts and culture central to the revitalization of the city, required changes to how the city government worked, including the creation of new agencies of government and public-private partnerships. So while it resulted in investments in the arts and culture sector, it defined arts and culture in ways that emphasized their role in boosterism, which we might call the Mike Rowe approach, rather than civic engagement, or what we could call the David Simon approach. So while Schaefer's administration may be remembered for large-scale infrastructure projects like Harbor Place or the aquarium, and his flair for showmanship, as shown in one of my favorite pictures from the book, him posing with a mermaid at the opening of the aquarium in 1981, I really want us to add to Schaefer's legacy his reimagining of city government to include arts and culture, for good and for ill, right? He really pioneered connecting image making as a job of government to infrastructure building, to recreate or to spur a different kind of redevelopment in Baltimore centered on arts and culture. And that's really what I'll be talking about for the rest of tonight. So let's do a little background on Schaefer for those of you who may not be familiar with his biography. So Schaefer was born in Baltimore in 1921. He became a lawyer, moved into politics in the 1950s with the help of longtime Democratic kingmaker Irv Covens. Schaefer decided to get into politics and was elected to city council in 1955 from the 5th District. Now, by 1967, he was city council president as part of Tommy D'Alessandro III's team. And for those of you that don't know, Tommy D'Alessandro III is Nancy Pelosi's brother. So Baltimore is everywhere and has influence everywhere. So by 1967, Schaefer is city council president, which is obviously a very important position. Now, in his time on the council, we really can see Schaefer's interests are eclectic and in some way, surprising, right? So at one and the same time, Schaefer supported civil rights legislation, which earned him a lot of goodwill and support in the Black community, which certainly helped him as he became mayor. At the same time, however, he was a supporter of urban renewal projects like highway building, that displaced many working class people in the city who were especially in the African-American community. Now, Schaefer became mayor of Baltimore in 1971 after D'Alessandro decided not to run again for mayor following the 1968 riot, which had called his leadership into question. So Schaefer rises into the position of mayor in 1971. And with this ascension to mayor, Schaefer became Baltimore's biggest booster. He saw a city that was struggling with racial unrest, economic problems, and loss of population, and bet that a new image for Baltimore could be created to turn the city around. In particular, he saw tourism as an opportunity for the city. One of his aides, named Bailey Fine, remembered, quote, he'd talk about downtown and a revamped inner harbor and tourism. People would turn and look at each other. Tourism? It was like working for a crazy person. It just wasn't going to happen, but he said it over and over. And that point, the aide's point was really underlined when the city decided to commission a marketing survey in 1973 to actually gather data about the potentiality of Baltimore as a tourism and culture destination. So they went around and they asked many people what they thought about that possibility. And one of my favorite responses was one anonymous respondent who said Baltimore, quote, is definitely not a cultural center. I don't know of anyone who ever went to Baltimore for a vacation or for fun. If they did, I have my suspicions about their sanity. So he had his work cut out for him, but Schaefer really recognized that there was a movement growing around the country that he thought Baltimore could be a part of. And that movement was around what people have called urban, or scholars have called urban branding. So in this era, we have the shift from urban boosterism to urban branding. And here I'm going to quote sociologist Miriam Greenberg, who's written an amazing book about urban branding in New York. And she describes it as, quote, standardized, coordinated, and capital intensive. As with corporate branding more broadly, this approach entailed a dual strategy that was at once visual and material, combining intensive marketing, in this case place marketing, with neoliberal political and economic restructuring. So as Greenberg is saying there, urban branding is the idea that a place, a city, can be given a brand identity, like we have, trademarked brands of consumer products all around us. So the idea is that you need to associate the place with particular qualities and characteristics, and that brand is then firmly planted in people's minds, and they can associate that place with something. But that's not just, that's not an easy thing to do. And so as Greenberg argues, it entails both image making, right? Creating those associations in people's minds, but it also necessitates changes in the way the government works to restructure the emphasis of the city government around wooing and catering to tourists and corporations rather than the working class residents of the city. Okay? And we can see a lot of examples of this outside of Baltimore. So, Greenberg talks about in New York City, the World's Fair of 1964, the Big Apple campaign of 1971, and the I Love New York campaign in 1977. And she argues that all of these had the same ultimate goal, which was to shift New York to being a city that catered to tourists and corporations rather than its own residents. Turning back to Baltimore, I think we can see how Schaefer committed himself to urban branding in a number of different ways. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is the creation of new city agencies and quasi-city agencies, or public-private kind of partnerships. So there were a number of them that Schaefer got involved with very early on. So in 1968, so this is before Schaefer becomes mayor, the Greater Baltimore Committee, which is a group of very elite kind of corporate leaders who shape policy in the city, Greater Baltimore Committee had created the Convention and Visitors Council in 1968. But basically, as soon as Schaefer becomes mayor in 71, he replaces it with something called Baltimore Forward Thrust, which again is one of my favorite names ever. And then very soon afterwards, a year later, renames it the Baltimore Promotion Council, right? And it is the Baltimore Promotion Council that in 1974 leads the Charm City branding campaign. So that's probably the nickname that most people at this point are most familiar and associate most with Baltimore. But actually, the Charm City campaign in 1974 was seen as a big failure in a lot of different ways. And again, we can talk about this more in the Q&A. But as you can see here, I have an image from the New York Times of how they were trying to brand Baltimore through the Charm City campaign. And of course, Charm City was only the first in a long list of slogans and names for Baltimore that were perpetuated through expensive marketing campaigns, right? I'm sure we could come up with a lot of them. The city that reads, believe, and my favorite, the greatest city in America. So we can see how this process begins in the 70s, but continues very much until the present moment. In continuing to talk about the Schaefer administration's recreation of city government, in 1974, Schaefer created the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Arts and Culture, which was tasked with supporting arts throughout the city. There was also the Baltimore Office of Tourism and Promotion, which was run by Sandy Hillman, who's a close associate of Schaefer's and who will show back up towards the end of this presentation. But it is this office that produced events, like large-scale city events like the City Fair, for example. So the point that I'm making here is that Schaefer's administration created this array of agencies and public-private entities that were tasked with managing arts and culture, promoting Baltimore, and bringing in economic development. So I want to pause and look at one of these a little bit more closely, which is the Baltimore Film Commission. And historians actually haven't paid much attention to film commissions, but I argue that they're really quite important because they do two major things, right? They sell the city's image through film and television production. And this I think is really fascinating, their whole purpose is to help producers and directors cut through city bureaucracy in order to get their films and TV shows made, right? So their political purpose is to make the city more business friendly. Right. And it creates this interesting tension within the city. So the city has created these bureaucracies theoretically to help ensure that people aren't taking advantage. But then through things like a film commission are figuring out how to help corporations and other entities get around their own rules. It's quite interesting in that regard. Now, the Film Commission made a lot of sense in the 1970s because it coincided with the rise of two film genres that were very popular at the time period, right? So the new Hollywood filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese were filming their movies on city streets, particularly very gritty city streets, to give them this air of authenticity. So if you think about a movie like Taxi Driver, for example. So location shooting was really important for the authenticity of those films. At the same time, you had the blaxploitation film genre, in which directors who were creating movies specifically for African-American audiences were also filming them on gritty city streets as well. And this we can think of movies like Shaft, for example, or Superfly. So Baltimore had been the setting for filmmaking before the 1970s. And again, happy to talk about that in the Q&A. You know, we can talk about John Waters' early films, for example, and others actually. But it's really in 1977 when Hollywood filmmaking comes to Baltimore. And it happens with three movies that are filmed there almost all at the same time. So the first is actually this pretty much forgotten movie called The Hitter, which starred Ron O'Neal, who was famous for playing the main character in Superfly. So he was really famous within the kind of blaxploitation genre. And in the film The Hitter, O'Neal plays a down-on-his-luck boxer. And the film is shot throughout Baltimore, throughout really a Baltimore on the cusp of redevelopment. So it captures the old harbor before the inner harbor is created. It captures landmarks like the Armistead Hotel, which would be torn down shortly afterwards. So there's an interesting way in which this film, which I said is pretty much forgotten, is also actually like a really interesting archival document of the city. Now, at this point in 77, the city had no official way. They didn't have the Film Commission yet, so they had no official way to help the production. But James Beek, who was another aide of Schaefer's, helped the director find suitable locations around the city. And then this was followed pretty quickly by the filming of two more successful films, but these were intended for white audiences and starred white actors. And these films were The Seduction of Joe Tynan and Justice for All. So with these three films being filmed there, filmed in Baltimore in pretty quick succession, it really showed Schaefer and his administration the potential economic boost of these productions. So in 1978, Schaefer creates the Committee on Motion Picture and Videotape Productions, which is located within the mayor's office. And I think that's important because it showed how closely he wanted to monitor what was going on in this new agency. Now, in creating what becomes the Baltimore Film Commission, Schaefer's actually competing with the state of Maryland, which was also creating a state film commission around the same time. And the competition between the two is difficult. It's hard on Baltimore because the state of Maryland can give tax breaks, right? So you often see that how like they woo productions by saying, we'll give you tax breaks. So the state can do that, but the city can't. Right. So the city had to argue to potential directors and producers that the city would be there to help them get through all of the bureaucracy and red tape and work around city policies to make it as easy as possible. And there are these great letters in the Baltimore City Archives of Shaffer being like, we will cut through red tape. We will do whatever we can to make this happen. And the reason, of course, that Schaefer's administration is so intent on doing this is there were they saw real benefit from it because these movies spread an image of Baltimore around the world and also brought in money to replace what was being lost in that process of deindustrialization, right? But again, it also suggests this tension within urban governance. Are city governments supposed to be focusing on ensuring economic development benefits residents, or are they supposed to eliminate bureaucracy to ease business investment? Are cities supposed to be entrepreneurial? And Schaefer very much came down on the side of cities being entrepreneurial. So actually, I want to read a short passage from the book. And this was really one of my favorite research finds. As I was in the Baltimore City Archives looking through the Schaefer papers and reading about the Film Commission, I came across some documents about an awards show that the city had created in 1978. So let me read this passage from the book. If Baltimore had become Hollywood East by the late 1970s, as Fontaine Sullivan, who was the head of what became the Baltimore Film Commission, argued, then it seemed only appropriate that it should hold its own version of the Oscars to honor filmmakers working in Baltimore. Called the Don, after Schaefer's middle name, the award ceremony was envisioned as the red carpet event of 1978. As its tagline stated, anyone can go to Hollywood and earn an Oscar, but you have to be in Baltimore to earn a Don. Now, chaos reigned behind the scenes as few tickets were sold and little money was raised. Even the local television stations refused to broadcast the event. Nonetheless, the event would highlight Baltimoreans working in film, both in the city and outside of it, and announce the creation of the Mayor's Film Commission. The list of potential Don awardees included Barry Levinson, a native son who had written the script for And Justice for All, and Betsy Slade, who acted in Kojak. John Waters was mentioned as, quote, the best independent filmmaker in the country today, whose films had been shown at the Cannes Film Festival. Members of the And Justice for All cast were promised to appear, though Sullivan noted that Al Pacino was, quote, temperamental, and it was hard to know whether he would show after all. Interestingly, the directors, producers, and actors in Amazing Grace, which was a movie that was filmed in Baltimore, partially filmed in Baltimore in 1974, African-American movie, and The Hitter were completely ignored by the organizers of the Don, even though Tom Cripps, a professor at Morgan State University, was to be honored for his book on the depiction of African-Americans in film, Slow Fade to Black. Films made by and starring white people, a spectrum spanning works as varied as those by avant-garde provocateur John Waters and middlebrow Barry Levinson, were suitable representatives of Baltimore's efforts to promote itself as a film capital. Baltimore's cultural representations mirrored the city's residential segregation, a process that would continue through the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. Cultural productions by African Americans remain separate from those of white Baltimoreans, rarely receiving the same level of promotion, funding, or visibility. The Baltimore Afro-American made this point in an article condemning And Justice for All. After positioning the film within the context of the beginnings of the mass incarceration of Black men, the author asks why the only Black actors hired for the film play extras in courtroom and jail scenes, while whites play judges and lawyers. Continuing on, the author asks, quote, were all the charges of police brutality swept under the rug just in time to cash in on Hollywood gold? The parallels between racist law enforcement in Baltimore and Hollywood filmmaking are clear. To be acceptable to Hollywood filmmakers, Baltimore had to hide its internal problems to woo economic development opportunities that tended to portray African Americans in stereotypical ways as criminals, if at all. With a deep bitterness, the article ends by noting that the film company is expected to leave $1.25 million in B more. It just might leave something else, a sense of shame, which might force the city to clean up its act. So the second part, or the second piece of the Schaefer's cultural redevelopment of Baltimore, I argue, is the interest by the administration in doing what they called animation. They wanted the city to be an animated space through a variety of different methods that, again, centered around arts and culture. But how they defined animation and how they defined arts and culture were very particular ways that I think are quite important to think about. So Sandy Hillman, who we we mentioned earlier, who is the head of the Baltimore Office of Tourism and Promotion, defined the goals of the Schaefer administration around animation as, quote, we began creating animation, creating happenings, turning the city onto itself, using public programming as a means of bringing people back downtown again. And we did it in these brand new public spaces that had been created through urban renewal, like Charles Center, or moving the variety of ethnic heritage festivals to the Inner Harbor. So how did they create animation? What did that mean? So Hillman described it as, quote, common denominator entertainment, which might include family-friendly street performers like jugglers or mimes, walking around the Inner Harbor, entertaining visiting families and tourists. What the administration was not interested in supporting as part of Baltimore's cultural redevelopment was art that depicted the city's struggling people and places, or that criticized the administration. But I do want to say that opening up a cultural space in public allows for alternative uses, right? So the City Fair, which began in the early 1970s as a celebration of neighborhoods, tried to emphasize the positive by having visitors stroll around booths for each neighborhood, right? And in this way, it tried to create this kind of overarching idea of an integrated, positive city. However, even here, the movement against destruction, which was a coalition of neighborhood groups that were fighting against the road or the 3A expressway, which was planned for South Baltimore, got a booth. And they used the city fair then to promote their activism against city government. So I'm really, most of this talk is from the perspective of the city and the administration, but I do want to emphasize that, there are ways in which people pushed back against this. And I think this use of the city fair by the movement against destruction is a really interesting one. So the culmination, I would argue, of Schaefer's ideas of marrying image to infrastructure came with an art project in 1981 called the Baltimore Promenade. So they got NEA funding for this project, and through it, the city commissioned a married couple who were environmental and conceptual artists, Helen and Newton Harrison. And they worked with the Baltimore Planning Department and the Maryland Institute College of Art on a project that was trying to imagine how to unite various sections of the city. So they saw that, there was a disunity between these areas of the city. So they wanted to figure out, how do we bring them together through art? So the Harrisons came to Baltimore. They talked to residents. They taught a workshop at MICA. And they did an exhibit where they showed these large-scale photos of the city. And ultimately, their answer to uniting the neighborhoods was really quite simple. It was this promenade, which was going to animate public streets by bringing people together. So I want to just read one more passage from the book. The central theoretical conceit of the project was the promenade. The Harrisons argued that a promenade is, quote, both an activity and a place, a stage on which people in a community meet and mix. Rather than walking with purpose, this leisurely strolling meant that there was, quote, a high level of amiability and conviviality on the promenade that created a self-regulating, ephemeral community that would discourage running, shoving, or behavior that would break the mood. Perhaps most importantly, the, quote, promenade is the only public adventure where you have permission to stare. The promenade aligned perfectly with Schaefer's vision. Art and municipal government could work together to reimagine public space to appeal to visitors and businesses looking to invest in the city. Indeed, the Harrisons project resulted in a series of suggestions for how to connect 4 areas of the city: the waterfront, Lexington Market, Antique Row, and Patterson Park, through small changes like creating a walking path around the Patterson Park pond and signage. The goal was animation. People would become the focal point, drawing other people. Rather than the pointed staring at Divine that John Waters captured while filming her promenades through the city in Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble, this would be warm and friendly. This panoptic gaze of everyone looking at everyone would ensure a safe, comfortable space for the majority. During the inaugural promenade on December 13th, 1981, which this photo shows, approximately 200 people, including Mayor Shaffer, quote, followed a handful of Pied Pipers playing flute and violin music along a trail sometimes strewn with trash or broken pavement, on a quest for a unified charm city. Yellow balloons streamed along the route, and cheerleaders, unicyclists, and jugglers entertained the walkers. A police motorcade, quote, made many of the walkers feel secure in areas where some conceded they might not have wanted to walk by themselves, even by daylight, suggesting that everyday life on these streets simply scared people from outside those neighborhoods. So who is a city's downtown for? As the Baltimore Promenade project showed, the downtown has been not only the linchpin of urban real estate and conspicuous consumption, but also an idealized public place, and thus a powerful symbol invested with civic meaning. By the early 1980s, Schaefer perfected a formula to renovate downtown Baltimore for a new economic moment. He used the arts to animate public spaces to woo tourists, business owners, and the upwardly mobile to interact with each other in contained activities where they were both audience and entertainment, and to define the city as both modern and charming. One of the taglines for the Baltimore Promenade project was, quote, "A pattern is forming." With the yoking of art to neoliberal renewal, the control of both the image of the city elsewhere and the use of space within it, a pattern was forming that would define Baltimore for decades to come. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Mary. So just a reminder to folks, if you'd like to add a question in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. I also know some of you are comfortable using Zoom, so if you would like to unmute and ask a question, we're also open to that. There are just a bunch of people here, so just be mindful. And I can also navigate if we get too many talkers at once. Just to kick it off, Mary, I had one question in terms of or related to the archival documents that you were able to find. And I was kind of struck by the point that you made about some of Schaefer's actions or decisions bearing image to infrastructure impacting the African-American community in particular in Baltimore. And I was just kind of wondering if you could speak to what types of archival records get at that part of the story or that side of the story. So I'll throw that out there to start.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. That's a great question, Allison. So, when I started researching the book, I began with, sort of the obvious, right? Big names. And so, the John Waters, Barry Levinson, David Simon, et cetera. But I was really determined to make sure that that's not where the research ended. And it took a lot of digging, frankly, to really find those African-American cultural producers who were making work, not because they weren't there, but because they hadn't gotten the same attention and visibility, right? So, so in terms of how I did that research, and of course, research is always about serendipity as well, right? So, Chicory, for example, which is the literary magazine that you mentioned earlier, which was published between 1966 and 1983 in the city, which certainly overlaps with the period that I'm talking about. I found a reference to it in a book that was published by the city as like a kind of boosterist book. I'm looking for it on my shelf. It's called Baltimore, A Living Renaissance. It was published in the early 80s. And there was a reference to Chicory having been published by the Pratt Library. And I thought, well, librarians really like to save stuff. So maybe Pratt still has it. And that's just, how I've ended up finding it. But I also spent, like I said, quite a bit of time in the Baltimore City Archives looking at Schaefer's records. One of the things that's really interesting and fantastic about a guy like Shaffer is he kept a lot of records and just like kept information about everything. So the records are like overwhelming. But I really tried to, go through anything that seemed related to arts and culture. And so kind of digging through that way was the way in which I was able to find those moments where there was intersection with, African-American communities, right? And sometimes it was very peripheral or sort of oblique, right? So the Schaefer administration supported the Baltimore Theater Project, which did the Baltimore Neighborhood Arts Circus, which was summer workshops in mainly the African-American neighborhoods of Baltimore, right? So, through there, you could find some information. But of course, those kinds of municipal records do not really get at the voices of the people. So they are limited in what you can talk about from them, which again is just why like Chicory as poetry written by kind of working class African-American folks is so interesting to me, because it is their voice recorded rather than just the kind of like, government records about it.
Awesome, thank you. So we do have a couple of questions that came in. This one is really very articulate, and I appreciate that. What role did media, so print, TV, primarily those things at the time, play in examining, endorsing, questioning, or challenging the image marketing the Schaefer administration undertook? And then there's just a comment that the individual would love your thoughts on Pink Positive Day.
Okay, so that's a really great question, and one of the things that I really look at in the book is the way in which administrations like the Schaefer administration marshal and bring artists into the fold as part of this process of urban branding, but also the way that artists push back against it, right? So one of the chapters of the book actually looks at how novelists, mainly novels and films in the 1980s, which is like the early 1980s, which is the moment, of course, of Baltimore's Renaissance, right? This is like 1980 is like the year of Baltimore, the harbor opens, etc. But you see at the same time all of these novels and films that suggest a hollowness at the center of that, right? And alienation. So I really talk in that chapter about the relationship there between whiteness and alienation, but it is also, I argue, a critique of the kind of urban branding that Schaefer is doing, right? So I'm looking up at my shelf. There's a great novel called Red Baker, which I'm not sure how well known it is anymore, but it's from the early 80s, set in Baltimore, about a steel factory worker who loses his job, a white guy. And there's this great scene where he and his buddy go to a bar that is basically like a kitschy tourist bar that is like selling and co-opting the image of Baltimore as this industrial city for tourists. And so it's a real commentary on that process that the city was going through at the time. So like, I think you can see it in those instances. And then the second thing I'll say is, I think you see it too in the way in which people tweak these slogans, right? So, you know, Charm City became the most famous slogan, but it wasn't really around that long as a campaign. But like slogan like the city that reads, right, was mercilessly parodied to say, you know, Baltimore, the city that breeds, or Baltimore, the city that bleeds. You know, so these are ways I think that regular folks push back against the branding to say, like, this doesn't represent our experience at all. And so I think that that's also part of it, even if it's, you know, sort of less of a kind of official or like a professional artistic response. I also think that that's part of it. The second part of the question was, sorry, can you remind me? No.
Yes, as I'm getting a visit from my Frank cat. So to add your thoughts on Pink Positive Day.
So if I'm remembering right, like that's when Schaefer painted all the city streets pink. So I think I don't have much more to say about it, except that I think it fits within this sort of larger narrative of Baltimore selling itself as kind of quirky, which is something that I talk about, again, related to the concept of charm. But one of the things I didn't get into that I talk about in the book is that I argue that there are primarily two images of Baltimore. There's Charm City, which is this kind of white, quirky eccentricity image. And then there's Bodymore, which is an image of African-American Baltimore as dangerous and deadly. And that it is that these images represent the segregation of the city of Baltimore through culture. So, you know, to my mind, I think like a lot of what Schaefer did really just fit into that kind of Charm City eccentricity. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So next we have a question about the genesis of Artscape and how you think that's contributed to the city's image, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I think Artscape fits pretty well within the structure that I'm talking about. So, you know, Artscape is, well, I mean, I think like all of these things, there are tensions within them. So on one hand, Artscape is a perfect encapsulation of what I'm arguing, which is a city using itself or selling itself as a sort of center of art. And there's a whole argument here also about gentrification that I didn't get into that I think is really important. The way in which art becomes a tool of gentrification, right? So that, you know, by selling the city as an artistic mecca, it is a way for the city to draw upwardly mobile people and also corporations. And at the same time, of course, Artscape is an opportunity for artists to present their work and to have a public space. So, you know, I think these tensions are always at play in all of these kinds of projects and activities. And, you know, I think that part of our goal as people who care about these things, right, is to try to push them more towards the side of promoting the local artist and to try to, you know, decrease the potentiality there of using it solely as a tool of like displacement and branding.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I guess this is a potentially related question, and I think it brings us more to the modern perceptions of some of these projects that you know, were done and then now need to be updated, but we're facing that difficulty right now in the city. Uh, we'd love to hear your thoughts on how the harbor might be revitalized or used in a way that's more accessible to Baltimoreans.
Yeah, I mean, you know, honestly, that is a great question for us to have as a group discussion, right? You know, because I certainly don't have any I don't have any solutions. You know, I think the one thing that's very clear is that the use of the harbor as a space for consumer activities, right? So like Harbor Place as a mall and the power plant and, you know, all of the kind of like shopping oriented stuff that was going on there is uh, obviously dead, right? I mean, like that's just not the future of any city anymore. And you know, we see it. You know, I live in Newark, New Jersey, and just you know, 10 minutes down the road from us, they opened a giant mall called American Dream that cost like billions of dollars because it took so long to build. I mean, it's got like a ski slope inside of it. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And it just opened last year, right before COVID. And of course, like it was never going to work to begin with, but then you add the pandemic and that's it, you know. There's no reason to do this anymore. And I think one of the things that's really frustrating in terms of being an urban historian is seeing how places and people make the same mistakes over and over and over again. So it's like we keep thinking that shopping is going to save us, and it's not, right? But I don't exactly know what it is that will save us. You know, I think, you know, the more sort of specifically local things that you can do, the better. And so for the Inner Harbor, I think, you know, it's a great opportunity to really rethink that space. And maybe what it is going back to the moment in the late 70s when, you know, they created the Inner Harbor as this beautiful park space and people loved it. You know, it was really useful for the neighborhoods of people who lived around it. And that shifted, right, as Harbor Place opened. And so maybe it is a matter of going kind of back to making these spaces really for the people who live around them and the neighborhoods that are there.
Thanks, Mary. So we have a few more questions that have trickled in. I know you touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but or maybe it was at your talk with the Pratt, but I know there are some viewers that are really curious about how you even came to start working on this project, especially since you live in New Jersey and, you know, that sort of thing. So if you could tell us, you know, maybe what got you hooked on researching Baltimore.
Yeah, I'll try not to talk too long about this, and this is like a true story. So I was in graduate school like 1,000 years ago, and I was writing a dissertation about class identity and how middle class people perform working class identity through style, right? And so I'm sitting on the couch watching TV, and there's this documentary that comes on PBS called People Like Us, Social Class in America. It's a great documentary, and it's got a section on Hon Fest. Right, which I always say Hon Fest, but I probably don't need to say that for you guys because you're probably familiar with it. So Hon Fest, if you're not familiar, is this annual, I would call it a heritage festival that takes place in Hamden every year. It was created by the Cafe Hon. And the idea is that it celebrates the this sort of Baltimore icon, a white working class woman from the 1960s called the Baltimore Hon, who's got like a big beehive hairdo and cat's eye glasses and this whole thing. Anyway, so they had a segment about this on this documentary, and I was like, and they were talking to women who come to this festival, and they're mainly middle-class women who are dressing up as this working class kind of caricature. I thought, wow, this is like exactly up my alley. So then I went to Hon Fest, and this was probably like 1999, 2000. So I went to Hon Fest a few times for a few years and interviewed people there. And I wrote about it in the dissertation, but it didn't make it into my first book. So I had all this like material, and as I began to research like Hamden, which at the time was really a neighborhood in transition, it was really changing from white working class to more upwardly mobile and like professional and less white. So I was really interested in how this festival fit into that. So as I began to research that, I just began to get more interested in Baltimore as a whole. And then I began thinking about, and I tell the story in the book, like I got to know a lot of women who dress up as Huns, including Charlene Osborne, who was Baltimore's best Hun a few years ago. And she was trying to pitch a reality TV show, like the Real Huns of Baltimore kind of a thing. And so she invited me to be filmed as part of their pilot, right? And the show never got picked up, but I like drove down to Dundalk and I sat in her garage, and this guy filmed me and asked me questions about Hon Fest and Huns and everything. And they had filmed like Charlene and her friends all day. And I just thought, like, there's something here. Like, even though the show never got picked up, I was like, they think that people know something about Baltimore, that this will like mean something. And anyway, and so then I kept thinking about how, again, for such a small city, Baltimore has just been the subject of so many different kinds of representations. And then, the historian piece of it was thinking about, at the time, I think this has changed a lot, but at the time that I started working on this book, there wasn't a lot of history being written about the sort of like more contemporary period in Baltimore's history. And that's changed, right? So, great stuff is coming out. I'm looking for my copy of Baltimore Revisited, but I don't have it at my hands to hand right now. But a book like that, which Nicole King edited along with Kate Drabinski and Joshua Clark Davis, is doing amazing work talking about the kind of more modern history of Baltimore. But at the time, it really wasn't being done. So that all came together for me to say, to suggest that this was a project that might be worth doing.
Thank you. It looks like we have a question from Charles, so I'm going to throw it over you two for
I had
like
sort of a comment more than a question. I was very fortunate to work for Donald Schaefer. Came here in 1976 to run the Civic Center, which became the Baltimore Arena, and to oversee the construction of the new convention center. And Shaffer was amazing. I remember one time there was something came up, and I thought it had political overtones, so I called him about it. And I remember him saying, "Young man, if I have to make your decisions, what am I paying you for? Make your own decisions. If you make the wrong one, I'll back you. Don't make it more than once." And that was all through his administration. The man filling the potholes on the streets was supposed to make that decision. He didn't kick it upstairs. That's why things got done during Schaefer administration. He also gave me, after we were successful with Sugar Ray Leonard, he had his first fight and 5 others here. And he had the director of finance open up an account for the arena, and we began to promote on our own. We brought in Pavarotti. We brought in Arthur Friedland and the Pops. These are things we never would have been able to do just by booking as a rental. And he supported all of that. And he was just an amazing man to work for. And that's one of the reasons he was so successful. So I don't want to take up any more time with it.
But thank you for that. And it's interesting, I mean, I've never lived in Baltimore, and I certainly, so I wasn't in the city when Schaefer was mayor. People have such fond memories of him. There really is a lot of love for him still. but as a historian who looked through his archives, I mean, what you described even comes through the paper documents. So you see people talking about how Schaefer would like go around to different city offices during the day to just check in, make sure people were at their desks, like, you know, or he'd be like down at the inner harbor, like making sure that like things were the way they should be. So he was really hands-on, and you have to, you know, you have to respect that quality. I think he really did love the city of Baltimore, even though in the end I disagree with some of the policies that he created. You know, his love for the city, I think, really came through.
All right. I think we're going to be winding down just a little bit, so I think I'll ask you one more question. But I will share all of the questions with Mary so that she has them, and I do have her contact information. So if you guys want to reach out to me after, if we didn't get to your question, you can feel free to do that. I'll drop my email address in the chat. So let's see. We had a really good question. About something specifically. Again, you see this archival theme that I have here. We had someone who wondered about the Schaefer and the Committee on the Arts and Culture's efforts of commissioning painted bridges for a project of bridges spanning I-83. So I wonder if you read anything about that, Mary, or if you noticed that in your research.
So I have to say, I don't know anything about that because, you know, my focus was more on the kind of popular cultural representations rather than sort of like just art, public art. But there's, like I said, tons of documentation in the Schaefer papers, and I doubt that the city archives is open right now, but when it is, they have all of it. So you could definitely get in there and take a look.
Thanks, Mary.
Allison,
yeah.
there's probably
What's up, Dean?
There's probably people on the call who know the answer to that, because it was a guy named Stan Edminster who did a lot of the painting, and he was connected to Mayoral Institute. I'll bet you Mike Franks and some of the other folks can answer that question about
this
the
is
actual
Elaine.
bridge.
I can tell
Elaine,
you the story.
Shoot, do the short version.
Stan was a total heretic, you know, original sculptor, colorist, and he loved working with those shiny surfaces. I forget what they call them, but it was a new material at the time. And
Mylar.
It had patterns. It had all these different patterns. And he had an idea to do the bridge, I think at Northern Parkway was the first one. And he said, I have this idea, you know, what do you think? And he says, okay, do it. The mayor said, yeah, try it out. We'll see what we think. And that was it. But it really never went. I thought it was an incredible success. I used to just burst into, you know, full smile ear to ear every time I would go under that bridge. And I don't know if anybody else remembers it, but because it was never the same twice. It was literally like, you know, like a world of rainbows. And that was pure Stan Edminster, who may he rest in peace. That's how that started, but it never, somehow, I don't know why it never took off. Nobody ever followed up, or the money never followed the idea. But it was Stan. Thank you. I'm glad Dean remembers that.
Thanks so much, Elaine. Yeah, I think we have a bunch of people on the call that, you know, sort of lived and worked and were in Baltimore, you know, during this era. And I'm sure that they had their own experiences with a variety of things, especially the cultural shifts and events. So thank you guys for being here. So I would like to just bring this to a close and thank Mary for being here with us. It's, you know, we appreciate you very much. And I know in a world of virtual schedules, I appreciate everyone taking the time to be here as well. So thank you, Mary, for your talk. If you guys have questions, I did just drop my email in the chat, so you can feel free to reach out to me. I would also just make a final plug for another event that is upcoming with BCHS. And we are going to be having another book talk as part of Doors Open Baltimore, where we will be well, Ron Cassie, senior editor of Baltimore Magazine, has teamed up with Red Emma's, and he will be talking about his new book, which I have a copy of here, and it has another beautiful cover. You can put these two together on my bookshelf, and it's just going to be wonderful. And I'll drop the link into the chat for that event. It's on October 16th, and you can register online through Red Emma's. We also have information about it on our BCHS website, so feel free to check it out there. I'll just throw it over to Mike for any closing thoughts.
Well, thank you. I think this tonight illustrated one of the things that we've seen through the whole course of these Baltimore history evenings. Whenever we get a modern history talk, which, modern history now back 50 years, that we not only get just, really erudite commentary by historian scholars, but really good first-person testimony by people who were there. And I find that that is just one of the pleasures of this series, is that, we get that combination of the scholarly look and the people who were actually there. So I think this was a wonderful night, and I thank everybody for being here. We have a Facebook page. For those of you who are on Facebook, Baltimore History Facebook page, you'll not only get announcements of events like this, but you can participate in an ongoing discussion quite often of Baltimore history. Quite often a lot of issues from the Baltimore past are still very hot button issues today. Unfortunately, we sometimes have to go in and referee there and cut things off. But there's, a lot of stuff going on. One of the things that we hope that we do in setting up this history Facebook page is to be one of these coffee shops where people interested in Baltimore history could come and share reminiscences, ask questions about historical questions, contribute to the myths and correct the myths. So look us up, Baltimore History on Facebook. And thank you, Allison. Thank you, Mary, for this terrific evening. Thank you all for being part of the ongoing life of the cultural history of Baltimore in the early 21st century. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, Mary. Good night, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks.